I'm going to show how to create this scales effect using Affinity Photo's procedural texture filter. This filter is based in part on the Reptile skin shader for Blender by Ducky3D. This is a rather long example, and you might want to review my videos on using cell noise before trying this one. The procedure I'm going to use for this is to start with a cell noise pattern, then add a second cell noise pattern at a different scale with some different properties, blend those two together, use a gradient map to add color to that, and then use lighting effects to give it the final three-dimensional texture. To get started, I'll start with an 8.5 by 11 because I want to use this as the background for a book or module that I might try to publish. The default for this is CMYK, so I'm going to change the color to RGB 16. I'll start with the fill tool, change it to black, and fill this in with black. I'm going to go to the live filters and add a live procedural texture filter. I'm going to start with a new equation. I'm going to assign it to all three channels. I'm going to start with variable v equals vec2 of rx comma ry times a divided by w, and I'll just show what that looks like with a v. I'll add my custom input a, set that to 1, and it looks like that. Now for my scales, I want them to have a plane of symmetry. So you can see right here, I have this plane of symmetry coming through here. And also in this one, I have a plane of symmetry this way. So I'm going to set mine up with a plane of symmetry right down the middle like this. So to do that, I'm just going to take the absolute value of Rx. Then I'm going to take cell noise, and I'm going to use the distance cell noise, dist. And to access that, I've got to go to v.x and v.y. So I can access the vector v and pull out the x and y components out of that. The cell noise functions require both an x and a y input. They won't accept just a vector input. And then I'll just use the letter b for the randomness factor. And I'll add that as a real variable. I'll just leave it at 1. As I bring up A, it controls the scale. You can see it starts to look like scales already. It's a little bit dark, so I'm going to add some controls so that I can change the brightness and range of brightness of the pattern. I'm also going to set this up as a variable. I'll call it T1 equals cell noise, and I'm going to multiply that times I1, and then I'm going to add offset 1 to that. So I have to add a slider for I1, and I have to add another, I'll do a -1 to 1 slider for the offset. So this will be my I1 value. This will be my offset value, OF1. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply this by 4, I think, 4 times that. So it'll give me a bigger range on that one. So now it's too bright, but I can easily bring that down with the slider there. I can also shift this around, and later on I'll adjust those, especially when I get my second pattern in here. I'm going to need to do that. So I'll go ahead and put in the second pattern. I'm just going to call the other one T2. And I'm going to have I2 and OF2 for that one. And so I'll add a 0 to 1 slider for I2 and a -1 to 1 slider for OF2. For my scales, I want them to be elongated in one direction. So to do that, I'm going to go over here and multiply this by 5. And then also multiply it by another 0 to 1 slider, which I'll call just I3. Put that in down here. You can see there they're quite long. I could change that number to a bigger number. Didn't really want to put it in as an input because I'm going to have quite a few inputs already. When I change the slider, I can now go to wide scales or narrow scales. So for this example, I'm going to have sort of narrow scales, what I want. I'm going to bring this down a little bit so that these will be my big scales, and then I'll have some other smaller ones mixed in here. To change the size of the scales, I'm going to do a similar thing with both the X and the Y and the T2 pattern. I'll multiply that by 5 times I4. And I'll multiply the Y times 5 times I4. And put in a 0 to 1 slider for I4. Now I can adjust the size of my second pattern with the I4 slider. The last thing I want to do is I want to blend these together. So I'm going to use a third pattern to blend them. So I'm going to create another variable, and I'm going to call it T3, and that will be a perlinhcubic. And I'll make it a h-cubic, a hyperbolic one, so it'll have just as much black as it has white. So it'll be balanced about that. And that takes V, so I'll just use, but I'm going to want to make this at a smaller scale than the cell is at. So I'm going to divide by another factor. I'll just use the letter C for that. And then I'm going to put in 7 for the octaves and a slider for the smoothness for this one. I'm just going to show a T3 so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so there's what it looks like. I can smooth that down a little bit. And then as I bring this up, it's getting to be lower and lower magnification, but I can move it around. I'll just probably leave that at I'll try it at 2. So the black areas will be one size of the scales and the light areas will be a different size scale. Now I'm going to blend the other two patterns, T1 and T2, using this T3 pattern to blend them. So I'm going to use the S interpolation, which is SERP, so sine interpolation, T1, T2, and then T3 will be the factor that merges those together, like that. So you can see in these areas I have large scales, over here I have small scales. I'm going to mix these together a little bit, and I'll try 1.5. And this one I can just adjust with that. And then I can also move around until I find a place that I think looks good. So that's the first step. Next step, I'll add a gradient map to these. And so it'll map the grayscale from black up to white, and it'll map each grayscale value to a different color using the gradient map. So I'll add an adjustment just to show how to do this. I'm going to use the so this is one I did before, sort of have a red dragon look to it, but instead of using that one, I'll start with the default one, and I'll show how I built this up. First thing, it'll work pretty well if you go from sort of a dark color up to sort of a light color. So I'm going to start with pretty much black, and then I'll make this one red and go up to I'm going to switch over to the HSL mode. It'll be a little easier to manipulate. And then I'll put in a nice bright red in the middle here. Fully saturated. A little darker. So something like that. Now, when I do the two different scales, I'm going to try to set it up so that one of them has different sort of color range than the other one. So down here, I'm going to set up another color range. So I'll set one up right here, make that nice and dark, and then I'm going to move this up. And I'll just manipulate these until I think it looks pretty good. And then I'll have this one, I think, go up to sort of a yellowish color, sort of a lighter color like that. Maybe a little bit gold. Make this one just a little bit on the orange side. And then bring these down. There's just a little bit of that. Now that I have a nice gradient map set up, I'm going to drag that down on top of my pixel layer so it's all grouped together, one layer here. I'm going to go back to my procedural texture, and I'm going to adjust this a little bit to try to get it to look a little better. I have these sliders set up. This one sort of controls the range of the value, and then this one controls an offset for it. So for this large pattern, I want to have sort of the full range going. I might actually bring this down a little bit like that, and then bring this up until it's in that range. Okay, and I want to go make sure it's all the way up to the top there. I'm seeing a little bit of the brightest color all the way up to the top. Now for the other one, I'm going to adjust that slightly differently. So I'm going to push this down, I'm going to decrease the range, and I'm just going to have it, you know, sort of like that. Now I might want to have, I'm going to see if I can get a little bit more variation in here. So I'm going to bring this down to 2, maybe 2.5. See what that looks like, and then I'll just go along until I find a place where that looks good. And then I'll adjust the look at the two sides over here to see if I can find a place where it's so I can balance it out so it's about the same balance, so it's fairly well centered on here. Okay, so that shows two different textures. Once I have a pattern that I like, I'm going to add lighting effects to it. It will be a little bit more difficult to change the pattern once I add the lighting effects, so I sort of have to make sure I really like the pattern before I go into the lighting effects. To do the lighting effects, I'm going to first turn off the gradient map adjustment. So there's my grayscale map. I'll click here, and then I'll do a layer merge visible. Now I've created a previous one with lighting set up on it, so I'm going to use that one. I'm going to use a light filter and my Phong 1 procedural texture from a previous video. I'm going to copy those and go over to this one and paste them in. There isn't a good way to save those as a preset, so I'm just going to paste them over here. And I'll just go over these briefly. I've covered these in other videos and they're somewhat long, so I don't want to go over them too much, but let's take a look at this one. The first one is the normal map, and this uses the live lighting effect, so add a live filter lighting, and this consists of 3 different lights. This will create the normal map for the effect. So the first one is to use diffuse all the way down, specular and shininess all the way up at 100, ambient at 0. Light number 1 is red with the azimuth is set to 0 degrees, the elevation is set to 30 degrees. It's a directional light. The second light, also directional, that one's green, so the RGB all the way up on green. If I switch this over to RGB mode, see it's green 255. Azimuth at minus 90, so down here at the bottom, and then elevation at 30 degrees. Also the texture is set to 10 pixels. And then the third one is just straight overhead, so right in the middle. So that's elevation at 90 degrees. That's right in the middle here. It's blue, again 10 pixels, and everything else is the same. Next one is Phong 0. It uses debump to create the lighting effect. So if I turn this on, I can create specular and diffuse lighting depending on how I arrange this. Now this will look better once I change the mode to one of the lighting modes. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'm going to go and turn the gradient map back on. And then for this one, instead of normal, I'm going to go over to one of these lighting modes. And these all work pretty well. I'm going to use the hard light for this one, but you could use like a vivid light or linear, any of these other modes. If you don't want much effect, overlay or soft light are good. I'm going to use hard light because I want to show how to do some stuff with that. So let's use hard light. It looks pretty little too much light on there, but when I go over into the Phong 0 effect, I can adjust that a little bit. So I'm going to swing this around and see if I can find a lighting effect that I like a little better. I'm actually going to leave a little extra more than I would typically have on here. Now I can adjust the opacity on this, so I could either turn it all the way off and then bring it back up until I have just the right amount of light that I want to have in the image. Okay, that's the scales effect. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and thanks for watching.